Thank you, firstly, for inviting me to speak. I'm going to actually take the discussion forward on built environment and talk more about overheating risk and how we can adapt to it, particularly for existing housing and care homes, which is part of our critical infrastructure. I'm going to give a little bit of background, which I think might be relevant given the kind of questions that have just come up. Then talk a bit about how overheating is actually affecting UK housing, both now and in the future. We all live in homes, so this is a problem that affects each one of us sitting in this room as well. We've used interdisciplinary approaches for that, drawing from spatial mapping, monitoring, also doing social science surveys and workshops, trying to understand how we can adapt existing, urban neighbourhoods. Then very recently, last week actually, we completed a project for Joseph Rowntree Foundation looking at care settings, care homes particularly, and what happens in that kind of a sector. How well is care sector prepared to tackle overheating? Because this is a real problem that's happening even now and will be exacerbated in the future. And then some key messages. I have got quite a few slides, but I'll go through them quickly, and they will be available after the talk. So just a little bit about us. So I run the Oxford Institute for Sustainable Development at Oxford Brookes University, and I have my own group called Low Carbon Building. We've done quite a bit of work in the area of climate adaptation and resilience, starting from over the last 10 years probably. In 2006, we did a study for DEFRA, looking at adaptation responses to climate change for new developments. So looking at greening buildings and how resilience could be embedded in those. Then the SNACC project, which I'm going to talk about for EPSRC. We did an EPSRC case project to see how heat pumps as a particular technological solution could actually be used to provide heat and possibly cool in future. We applied some of the learnings from these projects to real live projects through Design for Future Climate, looking at eco towns, looking at schools and at the hospitals as well. We used then building performance evaluation to look at overheating risk and resilience in new built social housing, actually looking at real monitoring data, and then of course the care homes. So I'm going to just focus on the two that I just said, the SNACC project and the care settings, but happy to take questions on other things as well. So just a quick background, why is this important? Why are we talking about overheating in UK, summertime overheating? When I started this, we had a workshop in Stockport and asked people about overheating, and they said bring it on. So it was quite a there is this welcome of overheating as well. One of the problems of that is that you can see water but you can't see heat. So the threshold at which one can die gets crossed quite quickly, without it being flooded as such. And in that sense, overheating is a real issue which needs regulation, which also needs a lot of planning. All the projections are showing, there will be a rise of at least 3 to 5 degrees in, summer average temperatures, depending upon where you live. Usually it's talked about high emission scenario, 50% probability. But this is not a future problem. I want to emphasize that this is a problem of today. We monitored some houses in Oxford towards the end of summer. This is end of September, October, some years back. And even then houses were overheated. Now that's almost the end of summer. Temperatures are going above 28 degrees regularly. According to current guidance, anything above 26 degrees is probably a problem. 28 degrees and above is a major issue. There are still discussions whether that's right or not, but that's what the current guidance is. But why does it matter for older population? It probably matters more for them because health evidence indicates that older people are more vulnerable to health effects of excessive heat. On top of that, in the UK, awareness of this risk to overheating is very much focused on the cold side for the care sector, not towards excessive elevated temperatures, which is a problem in itself. In the 2003 heat wave, there were 2,000 premature deaths that happened in the summer. Most of those in the older population were more vulnerable. So this is, again, as I said, a very real problem. So against this context, I'm going to talk about these two projects. The first one is SNACC, which is Suburban Neighbourhood Adaptation for a Changing Climate. It's got a website, all the publications are available there. So I'm going to whiz through the slides. That's why. So it's funded by EPSRC with 2 other universities. We focused on suburban areas, and the reason was because that's where the UK population lives. Most of us live there. That's where domestic lives get affected, and that's where change takes time to happen. Things don't get remodeled quickly in suburban neighborhoods. So our main question in the research was how can existing suburban areas be best adapted to reduce further impacts of climate change and withstand ongoing changes. So we were looking at adaptation and mitigation, and I want to emphasize that it's not either or. We have to look at both together in totality. So we were looking at what strategies really perform well in terms of technical performance, in terms of practicality, in terms of acceptability. We also tried to create hedonic models for costing them, but I don't think we were that successful because there weren't many examples of adapted neighborhoods or adapted homes. We chose to work in Oxford, Stockport and Bristol, primarily because that's where the universities were. There was no other probably reason. And how did we research this? We identified 6 types of suburban areas. We selected adaptation options. We modeled them. So we use physical models, engineering kind of spatial models to test the technical feasibility. We then tested them with residents. That was the challenge, to take the models to people, ask them, what was the acceptability. We also asked the stakeholders who would implement those changes. So, from policy making and, community groups and other NGOs. We then established why adaptations are not, being implemented or are being implemented, and what might enable those, residents to actually and stakeholders to adapt. So I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to pick up a few things, but as I said, this is published work, so we can read about that on the website as well. There were 6 neighborhoods, and the reason, or 6 suburban neighborhoods that we chose, they were different morphological configurations. Because we had somebody in the team who was an expert at this, and we chose one historic suburb, one new urban extension. In Oxford we chose kind of a pre-war suburb, and then we had a few in Stockport as well. So there were different kinds of suburbs, each having about 300 houses, 250 to 300 houses. We then used the decorum model, which is a model developed at Oxford Brookes, which is looking at how do you map energy use from houses, and then how you model a changing climate, particularly temperature. And what you see here are the effect of increase in temperatures, and the red ones are the houses which will overheat. So as we move to 2050s, high emissions, every house will overheat. 2030s, it's not every house will overheat. And why is that happening? Because that's quite important to know, so that we can adapt those houses. Firstly, regionally, on a national level, south and southeast is where the risk is high, from the climate and weather point of view. Less so in Stockport, and I just told you, even people there want to welcome it. In the neighborhood and garden side, because we were looking at homes, gardens and neighborhoods, the orientation matters. East-west facing houses will probably overheat more because it's quite difficult to shade the west facade particularly. So those are some big headlines for designers, for instance, for new developments. Homes on exposed streets, where don't have shading from trees, are problems. Darker pavements, and we tend to have darker external walls. So essentially what I'm saying is, if the reflectivity of surfaces is low, then you're going to absorb more solar radiation, which means the tendency of the built environment to overheat is higher. Inside homes as well, or the home itself, the configuration of the home is important. The built form is important. So if you have less exposed sides, that means less heat will be lost. So the tendency to overheat is higher. More glazing would of course mean more heat gains as well. The location of the glazing is important. So if you have roof lights, this could be leading to overheating. And of course, lightweight versus heavyweight. So if you have lightweight structures, by which I mean constructions which don't store heat, they might have a tendency to overheat more than heavyweight construction, depending upon other things such as ventilation. So some of the things were coming through, and this then fed into policy for DEFRA, and lots of other things happened. That time was the era of Green Deal, so lots of things were happening, but some things reached somewhere and others didn't. We also then we took archetypes from different neighborhoods and tested them for dynamic thermal simulation. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's essentially a sophisticated way of modeling energy use and potential comfort conditions, using quite detailed thermal simulations. And there's no need to understand what's written there, but essentially we were modeling a series of improvements, from insulation to double glazing to ventilation and shading. And what came out consistently was that a single measure that would be very effective was external shading. And we don't do that. If you look around houses in the UK, this is not something that's done. And that is also a design problem, because that can be done quite easily at the design stage. It happens in the south of France. In many countries, shading shutters are seen as quite a part of the urban fabric, and that probably needs to be considered. We also looked at packages, so not just single measures, but what if the whole wall has to be improved, wall insulation plus shading plus glazing, roof as well. So the roof is not just insulated but also reflects heat. So the external the albedo effect of the roof becomes important. The kind of heating system does it have, reducing internal gains. Remember, overheating in buildings can also happen because of gains inside the buildings. So the fact that there are many people, or the fact that pipework is not insulated, will add to the gains. And when we modeled them, we found that our package, which included everything, would probably reduce space heating and also address the risk of overheating. And that's quite interesting, because effectively we were combining mitigation with adaptation together. We were not seeing it as two problems, and unfortunately that's not how it's happening in reality. We then asked people, we took the models, and I've missed a few slides because of time, but essentially we took those models to workshops with people, and we asked them about the likelihood of implementing those measures. And just to pick up the first 4 ones, where red is the least likelihood, green is in the most likelihood, you can see actually shading is not something that's preferred by people, although the technical models show that it's a good thing. And that's quite interesting, because there are barriers to its implementation. We then asked residents and stakeholders what were those barriers for they being likely to choose an adaptation measure, and then on your right hand side for they being less likely. And I've just picked up a few of them. So the fact that it has lifestyle benefits, there are cost savings, and it could be done easily is seen as a good thing. But then there are also barriers, that it is some of the measures were seen as expensive, loss of house space, requiring external approval, and those things need to be addressed, and how some of those adaptation measures could be actually implemented as part of home improvements rather than they being seen an add-on. So what were the key findings from this study? Again, I'm giving you a very brief overview of a large 3.5-year project. Some of the things that came up at the neighborhood scale was introduction of blue and green infrastructure. So proximity to green spaces, having trees in the street, looking at stable urban drainage systems, but there were lots of uncertainties over the implementation, particularly about cost and responsibility for installation and management. And that's quite interesting, that although there are solutions, how they will be implemented and maintained are issues. We did promote that we should be talking about adaptive retrofitting, not just low carbon retrofitting, because we don't want to solve one problem at the cost of the another, because we could create another problem. And for that, we were promoting package developments and not single measures, to avoid lock-in, to avoid suboptimal retrofitting. As a single measure, because I was constantly asked what is the single thing that we can do from this project, and we said shading is actually seen as an important measure that should be really installed. Operation of shading devices, so if you're talking about shutters, is a behavioral change. It will also throw up other problems in terms of occupant behavior, but then those need to be tackled as well. But we felt shading was an important one. External insulation is seen as an important measure for mitigation, but from an adaptation point of view, particularly for overheating, the finishes could be light in color so that it could reflect heat, and that happens in Australia, for instance, quite a bit. But there are issues, there are planning issues, of course, there are cost issues, there are aesthetic issues as well, which need to be tackled. And also, reduction of internal gain, of course, we want to minimize the gains from inside by, insulating pipework and hot water tank, which are actually interestingly same as mitigation measures for housing as well. We actually used some of this and then applied it to one of the retrofit for future projects. This was funded through Innovate UK. And essentially it was a deep retrofit of a 1990s terrace in London to achieve 80% reductions in carbon emissions. And what we did here was we kept the house naturally ventilated and built in a ventilated loft alongside with windows which could be left open even when they were closed, so they were secure windows. And you can see that here, where there's this kind of a window. This was specially designed with a company to ensure good ventilation. The house didn't achieve 80% reductions; it achieved 70%, but very happy occupants because of this Venturi effect happening with the ventilation. And it was actually good to think about this adaptive retrofitting at the time of the low carbon retrofitting. But then moving on to the next project, I still have 10 minutes, which is good. This is a project then which has been released by JRF last week, actually 12th of May. The final report has come out. And essentially, we were asked to look at overheating in care settings because you would expect care homes to be very safe, resilient, protecting their residents against heat and both cold, of course. And we've set out to do a 15-month study with University of Manchester and Lancaster University as well, which was quite socio-technical to look at how existing care homes are fit for a warming climate and what is the preparedness of the care sector, because this is a real problem with an aging population and overheating becoming a concern as we go forward. We used building surveys, so we used a case study based approach. We studied about 4 buildings in detail, 4 care settings, and also had another 11 to draw from. So we did building surveys to identify physical features which could enable or prevent occupants and their carers to control the thermal environment. So what was happening from the building side. We did some modeling, to see how big was the risk in the future for overheating using dynamic thermal simulation. We monitored the environmental conditions last summer. It wasn't a very hot summer, unfortunately, but it was okay. There were some short heat waves. And we cross-related that with interviews with designers, development managers, scheme managers, carers and residents to assess how design, management and operation and occupant practices were actually affecting overheating risks. And then we created some recommendations for policy and practice. So the 4 care settings were 2 care homes, and just for those who don't know, care homes are they usually have single bedrooms with access to on-site care services, and 2 extra care which are slightly more independent, and they either have bungalows or flats, and they're designed for people with mobility difficulties with some help and support available if necessary. So these were the 4 case study care homes that were on which we did some primary research. We monitored them, and essentially what you can see here is the threshold that Public Health England gives for care settings is 26 degrees. So what they are saying is that we should make sure that the care homes don't go above 26 degrees, at least one room there. What we were finding constantly in a relatively cool summer, temperatures were above 28, sometimes reaching 30 degrees. There was a short heat wave, we might remember, towards the end of June, July, and in that period we felt or we measured that there were high temperatures in all rooms before, during and after the heat wave, going above 26 degrees all the time, but actually going even above 30 degrees. So the guidance or the suggestions by Public Health England were clearly not being met in any of the settings, and all the care homes, irrespective of their construction, orientation, who was managing it, were overheated quite a bit. We also then modeled it for future, just to see what the models tell us. That was the real data, but designers tend to use models. And the models were interesting. The models told us for the current climate, there was hardly any risk for overheating. This is from modeling. For 2030, there was a little risk, but until you hit the 1%, there is no risk actually. Then in 2050s, the risk becomes slightly bigger. And then by 2080s, the risk is slightly higher. So essentially, the models were saying there is no current risk. There might be some risk by 2050s, but the measured data showed that the risk was actually in every care setting now. And that's itself a problem, that there is a gap between what the models tell us and what we measure. And I think that that's been quite an important find from the study. Now, I'll just take you through the last few slides in terms of the key headlines from this study. The first key finding was that there is a culture of keeping warm, this thing that older people feel the cold. So heat is not seen as a significant health risk, cold is. So there's low prioritization of overheating. The provision of warmth is also associated with good care, and that is a barrier in itself, because high temperatures are not seen as undesirable, and that needs to be challenged to some extent. the modeling and monitoring showed a big mismatch, and that's quite a worry because on one hand the modeling indicates that there's future risk, monitoring is saying there's a prevalent and current risk of overheating which needs to be tackled. So our recommendation was that we need to move towards some kind of a sensing system which can measure overheating. The third was that there's a lack of standardized criteria for assessing this risk of overheating. If we want to build resilience, we need to first know how bad it is, against which we have to be resilient too. And there are a raft of standards from SSE related to comfort, for internal temperatures. There's another whole multitude of standards from the health side related to external temperatures at which they say overheating might occur. But there is no statutory maximum internal temperature for care schemes, which is a problem because that is not seen as being an issue. The fourth finding was that there's lack of effective heat management. In some of the care homes, we found the heating system left on. So there was a lot of heat gains from the pipework itself, unwanted heat gains. There were conflicts between, for instance, using blinds versus having a view out. So you can't have blinds in rooms which are occupied. It can only be unoccupied. You can't open the window because of window restrictors because of health and safety reasons. So it reduces the flow of ventilation. So there were quite a few of these conflicts. And overall, there was a lack of awareness and prioritization of overheating risk, both from the designers where and also from managers where there was not much knowledge about public health England heat wave plan. The routines of residents themselves were a barrier because they couldn't be changed. Residents have to the certain way of dressing, certain way of wearing clothes, which is quite difficult to change if there is a short heat wave, let's say. So what were the overall findings from this study? One, summertime overheating is both a current and future risk in care schemes, but there is very little awareness and preparedness for it, which is quite a worry. And this starts from designers right through to care staff. There's a perception that older people feel the cold, and we need to balance it out. That heat is also a significant health risk. There is design for overheating is not commonplace. So although we talk about green buildings, we hardly talk about adapted buildings. We don't consider climate adaptation to be part of that. There's a mismatch between modeling and monitoring. And then finally, we recommended that there needs to be close collaboration between government departments and professional institutions to almost harmonize and standardize these overheating criteria, which are quite a few, so that so that this risk can be identified consistently and also addressed. Thank you.